Hi, I'm Pamela Wallin. Welcome to the latest episode of No Nonsense. The Secret Life of Artists. Have you ever heard of the Regina Five or the Emma Lake Collective or the Saturday Night Group? I heard some of these stories from my favorite artist in Saskatchewan, Dorothy Knowles, and we wanted to learn more. I mean, who knew about these gatherings of artists? So we went to the expert, Sandra Fraser, who is the curator at the Remai Modern in Saskatoon. She's got a long list of credentials, having worked at the Mendel Gallery before, the McLaren Arts Center. She's done exhibitions. She has a master's in art history, so she probably has a fact or two at her disposal. So Sandra, welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great. I love talking about art. And, you know, we've been closed for 4 months.
Exactly.
So
it's true.
I might be a bit rusty, but
you can't do your work and nobody can go and look.
Yeah.
So people can still go online. I want to get into this whole thing, but just help me out here just because this is not my world. Is it a museum, a gallery, a collecting museum? How do you describe the Remai?
Remai Modern, we describe it as a museum because we have a collection.
Okay.
But it's quite common, especially in Canada, for art museums to be called galleries.
Right.
Because largely what they're doing is exhibiting work and interpreting it for the public. The larger institutions that are really showcasing the collection is a real centerpiece, tend to be thought more of as museums. And so it's interchangeable. You could be an art center, an art gallery, an art museum. You may actually have all the same functions.
So it's not just that I didn't know what I was talking about. It's just there's
interchangeable terms.
And there's something like 8,000 pieces of art or art installations at the museum / gallery.
We have about 8,000 art objects.
Wow. And this Picasso collection, which has art aficionados everywhere just drooling at the prospect.
It's quite a nice collection of lino cuts that came largely through Picasso's printer. So we have things that are the working states and proofs, largely unexhibited. So you get a real sense of the artist's process and the process of making a lino cut. So that's what's really special about the collection that we have.
Amazing. Well, when everything is back to normal in our world, everybody should definitely go. We went a couple of years ago to present this award to Dorothy Knowles, and we had lunch there. We did a tour. There were some works by her husband, William Perehudoff, there. Hers weren't up at that point, but they subsequently were. And she started telling these stories about how artists in Saskatchewan were functioning in the 50s. These would have been prairie people who were the product of the dirty 30s, and then 20-something and starting. And so they had a real connection to the land in many cases. Tell us a little bit about how that developed and that worldview. I don't know if there's a name for it or...
No, I don't think you could simplify it to that extent. I would say things really started happening in the 30s.
Okay.
When the University of Saskatchewan offered its first credit courses in art. It was the fourth university in Canada to have an art department.
Imagine that, eh?
Yeah, pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So Gus Kenderdine was the main art instructor at the university. At the same time, he started summer school up at Emma Lake, which was a 6-week program, largely teaching teachers about how to teach art. And it was largely women. But it was this really amazing setting to learn about art and get away from it all. And about 20 years after that program started, the summer school.
That was in the mid-50s, right?
Well, this started in 36. So this was the Murray Point Summer School.
Okay. Yeah.
And in 1955, a couple of professors at in Regina, because that's where the art school
was in the old campus on College. Yeah.
Yeah. They advocated for adding a 2-week workshop for professional artists. And that's what became the Emma Lake Artist Workshop. And that's the one where artists from all over came to lead these workshops and were hugely influential.
People. That's what Dorothy was talking about, that these Americans would come up. They were, mesmerized by the geography and the space and the freedom, but that these were names. These were very influential. I don't, you will tell me some. I don't know them all, but she said it was a real meeting of minds, and it became an influence on how artists in the U.S. gathered as well. They kind of used this as a model.
Yeah, it influenced, I think it's the Triangle workshops that came out of it. But it was a lot of the artists who came at that time weren't necessarily as well established as they came to be.
Yes, right.
So that's something to keep in mind when thinking about how big they were. Some were definitely very well established, some not so much. But the fact that they were intrigued and excited about coming to Saskatchewan was criticized for aesthetic colonization. So just another,
really?
form. Yeah. So it has its good and bad, but it was a very generative moment. It's not just that moment that was really generative. What was happening in the 30s also was very generative, because you had a bunch of artists who largely had immigrated to Canada previously and had maybe, let's say, uneven training as artists, because a lot of artists at that point didn't go to art college. Right. That wasn't what was required. It was a lot more learning on your own and through mentors. That period was deeply exciting and really established, I think, the confidence in the artists to find their voice and to make a career as artists.
What was it about the 30s? Was it just everybody was in the same boat as starving artists? Everybody was starving.
Everybody was starving in the mid-30s here, yeah. I think it was a number of elements, but one figure who was really important is Ernest Lindner. And he emigrated from Vienna. And he came here as a farm laborer, although he had no experience, but that's how you could come in the 20s. And he was lonely, and he painted and drew to pass the time. And Gus Kenderdine saw what he was up to, because of course it was a small population, small world then, and really encouraged him. And so Lindner kept doing it, but he found a passion as a teacher. I mean, he got a job teaching at the Technical Collegiate downtown, and he worked there for over 30 years.
But teaching art?
Teaching art, yeah. Okay. He became the head of the art department. I think he struggled at first.
Yes. But
it was a way to make a living. And somehow that experience, he found his calling, right, relating to people with others about making art. And so he wanted to generate a larger community. So one of the things that Dorothy probably talked to you about were the famous Saturday nights. And those happened at Ernie Lindner's home.
Okay.
For over 30 years.
Artists would gather on Saturday night. What did they do?
They talked.
They talked about art. They weren't arting.
They maybe drank and ate.
Yes, I'm sure there was some of that as well. But they weren't sitting around painting together.
No, not in this particular case. So it started. There was a group of professors at the U of S who would go to the Hudson Bay restaurant Saturday nights and have a meal. There were scientists and professors working in various languages. Lindner kind of ingratiated himself with that group and then transferred the group to his place. And of course, his interest in art, he invited more artists. Anybody coming through town.
How many people? Like what kind of a scene are we talking?
Dozens, I guess. Yeah. And it was a regular thing, go to Ernie's
On Saturday
on
night.
Saturday nights. And they would talk about, art, obviously, but religion, spirituality, whatever topics, came up. So it was this really more intellectual kind of milieu.
Discussion of.
And interdisciplinary.
Right.
It could be musicians or other kinds of artists, plus scientists.
Right.
And I think that really galvanized the community.
And then did that become the Emma Lake?
No.
Okay,
no.
that's a different group of people.
Yep.
Okay.
That's an independent thing. So Ernie Lindner he definitely supported the art school that Gus Kenderdine started, and he was definitely supportive of the Emma Lake Artist Workshops, and he attended them, but he wasn't so pivotal in terms of organizing those. And he had an island at Emma Lake called Fairy Isle.
And people could go and stay and did?
Yeah, he would have people over. He was super social, and so he would gather people at his place. Dorothy and her husband, Bill Perehudoff, also had a cabin up there. Right. So did Kenderdine. So in addition to the art camp, and we call it the Kenderdine campus, there were lots of people who had their own cabins. And so it was this very social.
As we call it in Saskatchewan, as opposed to cottages. Yeah, everything's exactly. A cabin, yeah. So that then they would meet each other, obviously, in the same space and start to gather.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. There's like this real urban thing. And Lindner was really trying to create that urban density. And the other artists were too, right? Being vibrant and urban. And then in the summers, it was more of this idyllic retreat, but still maintaining a lot of those ties and a lot of those conversations, but a different setting.
So who are the names? Like who emerged from that who wouldn't have been known to anybody then? They would have been a group of people that hung out at the lake and got together for dinner on Saturday night. And then 20 years later or 30 years later, they're sought after names and artists.
Yeah. Well,
Dorothy Knowles, Bill Perehudoff.
Yeah. So some of the artists, Rita Cowley would be another one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Antonia Eastman, Winona Mulcaster. She was a big one, and she was a teacher, so she was very influential and beloved. Leslie Saunders, who was a scientist, but also photographer and painter. George Swinton, and he actually was the first, was he the first professional curator in Saskatoon?
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he was also a painter.
Right.
Bart Pragnell and McGregor Hone would be some other names.
And so those are people that would be today in their 80s or 90s or no longer with us.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these artists have passed away. Yeah. They're like the earlier generation.
Right.
Even like Bill Perehudoff, who has also passed away. He's really second generation.
Right.
So he was one of
That's
the young
what I'm thinking
young
about,
kids.
the ones who were getting together, were born in the 30s, but were emerging as artists in the 50s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the one thing I think was interesting about Lindner too was the range of ages, right? So you'd have the more established folks, and then you'd have the students, because he was a teacher. He would have a lot of contact with students and young people. And so I think that's a really great energy to have.
And they were really mentoring. They really were mentoring the young ones.
And through the Saskatoon Arts Centre, which Lindner was really instrumental in establishing, they would have exhibitions. They had exhibitions like every 2 weeks. When I think of that schedule, I just...
Saying, please don't make me do that.
Too much.
So what about the Regina Five? What's that?
So the Regina Five is closely associated with the Emma Lake artist workshops in terms of the fact that two of the professors were really the ones who started and advocated for the artist workshops to take place. But they were...
And did they go on to become famous artists as well, those 5?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was a short-lived movement, but they got the attention of the National Gallery of Canada. So their work was shown in Ottawa. And that's always like a huge thing in this country. Maybe not so much now, but at that time, you got on the map, right? Yeah. In that sense. And so they're much better known in Canada than a lot of other Saskatchewan artists.
So what was the connection or the interconnection or the knowledge of the group of 7, say, for example? Does any of this cross paths?
Well, the group of 7 would have not had that much of an impact in the West because they were a pretty short-lived group as well. But certainly Arthur Lismer and Lauren Harris were huge proponents of the national school and came to Saskatoon and other cities promoting a national school of painting, and school not as in a building, but a way of painting that's really rooted in place. And certainly Lismer was a real advocate for arts education across the country. He's influenced arts education programs in museums, and in schools.
Let's just go off on that for a moment if we could, because that's what we always see cut in schools, art, music, when there's budget constraint. What's the state of the nation on that right now? I don't mean in the COVID area, I mean more broadly.
I think you're right. Like, it's a precarious field. I think there needs to be a lot more arts education, of course.
Of course you do.
But I think too, like I have 2 kids who've gone through the public school system, and I didn't feel that the arts were taken seriously. It was the thing that you did when the math and all the important subjects were dealt with.
It was done. And then you went and colored.
Yeah. And it's like, art is central to your being. It teaches you problem solving and risk taking and collaboration and creative thinking. Like, who doesn't want that? Right?
Exactly.
But I think people get fixed in their idea. Well, you need these things, or I don't want my kid to be an artist.
But if you don't have any talent, you also fail art, right? I mean, that's the other side of it, right?
Which is dumb.
Crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't need to have talent. It's not about that.
Right.
It's
expression.
It's absolutely. And it's so vital. I think it's incredibly vital and gives people, like, you look at, I can think of a number of artists and they didn't do well in school, right? Like, their voice, their way of thinking and being was not nurtured and supported. And it's not that they knew necessarily they wanted to be an artist, but it's just, making room for other ways of thinking about the world. Like, how about some empathy? Right? Like, math doesn't necessarily teach you empathy.
Right.
It could. But
not necessarily. No, exactly. No, that's, I think, we tend to see everything as terms of pass or fail, or it's good because it's worth more than something that's not good, when that may not be the case at all. This may be a brilliant piece, but the artist is unknown, so it doesn't have value in the same way. It's a kind of a crazy way to deal with this.
Yeah, and arts education also teaches you about process.
And patience.
Yeah.
This notion of when others came, I mean, you said that the connection, for example, with the group of 7 was a little more tangential, right? They were in different parts of the country. Is there such a thing as prairie landscape art? Is there such a thing as prairie modern art? I'm thinking of Bill Perehudoff and Dorothy Knowles, too. They couldn't be more different in terms of what their expressions were. Or were there just not the numbers? How is it even viewed?
I mean, certainly you can make generalizations that the landscape is a predominant theme with artists, as is abstraction, which Perehudoff aligned himself to, and a number of other artists like Eli Bornstein. So there's definitely a strong school of abstraction. And that has something to do with the fact that both Bornstein and Otto Rogers were the main professors at the Saskatoon campus in the art department. So God help you if you're a figurative painter.
At that particular time. Right.
It would have been really challenging.
Yes.
So yeah, those are definitely two dominant threads. But I don't know. There's enough variety, I think, within that. And they are so different.
Right.
It makes it very difficult to lump it together. Like this
that's
is
what I'm trying to figure out.
Saskatchewan
Exactly.
style.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because I tend to think of it as landscape, but that's my thing. I mean, that's what I'm attracted to. So that's what I see. A painting of, the Qu'Appelle Valley or a prairie landscape and a big sky. But there was all sorts of other things that generated from the same geography, the same time, the same mindset.
And of course, there are artists who are working in film and working conceptually, working with figure. There's so much more.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems with art history and history generally, is that we tend to write out the margins, right?
And look for some grander themes.
You kind of, it's the grander themes and the consistency. How can I talk about all of these things in a succinct way?
Yeah.
When you have
if they're all different, right?
Yeah, if you have a few people rubbing at the edges, it gets a bit more challenging to weave that into the story, and that tends to get written out, like all of the women artists throughout history, right?
So is there a story? I mean, this is your job. You're a curator, and you do, presentations, galleries, shows, exhibitions. What would you say the story is about art here in Saskatchewan, or maybe just in the prairies, or maybe it's a Canadian thing?
Oh, well, I certainly see myself as a storyteller. Like I use artists.
Yes.
I use artists to tell stories.
Are you an artist?
No, I'm not. I'm an art historian.
Isn't that amazing, eh?
Yeah.
You love it, though.
I love it, yeah.
But you don't pick up pencil or pen or brush?
No. I like to write and I like to garden, but...
Okay, sorry, I interrupted. Carry on.
As much as I do generalize, I try to find a node, like what we're talking about today. We're really looking at a few distinct moments.
Right.
I have an exhibition up at Remai Modern right now, which we'll be able to see when we reopen in August. It's called Next Year's Country. So I use the
Which
collection.
is a very common phrase here. Next year country. Next year the crop's going to be better.
Right.
Hang on. Yeah.
So I use that expression to look at the collection and think about what does it mean to have that sense of optimism, right?
Yeah.
So looking at work in the collection that I thought spoke to that. So a lot of the work is by Saskatchewan artists, but it's not all landscape, right? Some is figurative. It's like looking at what does that sentiment mean? That persistence and that hard work and that expectation that things will be better.
Well, that's what always gets me, because you're so dependent, if you're in the agriculture, if you're a farmer of any description. So you've got a beautiful crop and it hails. It's all over. There's nothing you can do. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But it always is about next year, that next year country, right?
Yeah.
So where does that come from?
Right.
What have you figured out about that?
Well, it's that determination.
Yeah.
I think, the the human spirit, determination, keep on going.
That's what I keep coming back to, this dirty 30s stuff again, because my grandparents lived through that, and I saw that in them, that it shaped them so profoundly, which is why I think COVID might be a little bit of the same. Obviously not as in terms of length. Well, we don't really know yet, but that made them who they were, getting through that with no crops, with animals dying, with the dust in their throats and their eyes and permeating their clothes. I mean, it changed the way they looked at trees and water and the ground. They just had a very different sensibility from those of us who grow up in concrete and cars with air conditioning and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this particular exhibition, I tried to pull apart the generalizations that might come with that expression, especially for people who know what it means, right? Because it was an expression that I knew before I moved here, right? And that's what really piqued my curiosity.
Right.
And also inserting the Indigenous perspective, right? Because settling was dissettling, unsettling, right?
Yeah.
So what I tried to do with that particular story, like touch on the history of Saskatchewan, but also find those cracks and fissures and complicate the story, flesh it out a bit more. So that's something that I try to think about when you've got to have some kind of thesis, right, to hold it together. Yeah. But you also don't want to flatten it out so much that it's this unified experience. So
what's the story today? I mean, could any of this happen, or it just doesn't need to happen? I mean, an Emma Lake collective or a Saturday night. Is it just we live in a different world, so you can go and consume things through technology? Are we missing that whole, as you say, multidisciplinary conversation that went on about art? They weren't doing it. They were actually thinking it through.
Well, certainly in terms of the artist's workshop, that wasn't a collective, right? So it was different people all the time coming and going, different coordinators, different artists, different participants. So there's definitely room for that kind of experience. It's 2 weeks, get away from it. Right. In this really compressed environment. I think that is a really valuable experience for a lot of artists and workshop leaders, whether they're artists or curators or writers, to meet new people and to, it's the ingredients in the pot that shape the experience, right? It can never be the same. Right. So that, I think there's definitely room for that. And a lot of people here would love to see that happening again. In terms of the Saturday nights, that's like an individual dynamic. You need that person who's got that energy.
That hosts the salon.
And without it, even if you have people who are interested, without that magnet to kind of pull it together, it's not going to happen.
And it's a moment in time.
And there have been other figures, maybe not as influential, because at that time, Lindner was really trying to find venues for artists to show their work and to support each other. And so there was artists who were members of the Saskatoon Art Association, which became the Art Center. They're a member group, so they pay fees, but they could participate in juried exhibitions, exhibit their work, participate in critiques. So you could bring the stuff you've been working on in the studio and show it to people, get the feedback. So that was really important at that time, 30s, 40s, 50s. The university was still just... the 50s, where the university was really getting a bit more established as in terms of really being an art department. So it really filled a void within the community, right? Not that void still isn't there, but maybe the physical manifestation of it through an art association or through a center, or through a collective, the necessity isn't pronounced. I mean, we had a number of artist-run centers in Saskatoon. In the 70s, there was the Shoestring Gallery, started by a group of women in 1971 because they wanted more representation. That's now AKA Gallery. It has a broader mandate now, but that was, grassroots organization. Also Photographers Gallery and Video Verite. Video Verite started a bit later, I think closer to 1990. But the Photographers Gallery, I think, emerged in the early 70s. It's now Paved Arts, so it's evolved. There was another arts organization called Tribe, which is no longer, but that was Indigenous video and performance, and they didn't have a space. They would just use other people's space, which was a brilliant way to run an organization because you spend so much money
on overhead and all of that.
Yeah, on the real estate. And there have been other arts organizations, but those are some of the key ones within Saskatoon. So yeah, artists find a need to organize, but you do have to have the right kind of people. Exactly. Right? Because it's exhausting work. Right? You really have to be a bit of a politician and a fundraiser, administrator. And sometimes you just want to be an artist.
Yes, just go to your room and do it. I have a couple of questions before we go, and they're unrelated, but not really. So you talk about women artists getting together, or Indigenous artists getting together, or maybe male artists, who knows, getting together. Is that a reasonable way to look at it? Should I go to a gallery and a museum because I want to see women artists, or I don't know, Black artists or Indigenous artists? So I'm going to ask you that question and then also put it side by side about, somebody like me who consumes art with not too much knowledge or history, but I know what I like, and I don't really stretch my wings. I will look at things that I like to look at, and I'm not going to read the books or become an art historian. And is that okay too, just to consume art or appreciate art in that way? How do you see it from your vantage point?
Okay, I'll answer that one first.
Okay.
But absolutely. I mean, you don't have to be a filmmaker to go to a movie. Go to the movies. Right. You don't need to be an author to read books, and all books are, worth reading. Yeah. Right? To somebody. I mean, we all have our own tastes. Right. And some is certainly not literature, but it's still reading. But yeah, and I think if you're open-minded, I mean, I would say that about everything. Be open-minded, even food, right? Yeah, we all like what we like, but you can try something new. And if you're going to galleries or museums, you're going to see some of the things you like and some of the things you don't like. Yeah. And you'll be like, and what the heck is that? Exactly. Right. So, but maybe you read the label, or maybe ask somebody who's there. Yeah. Or maybe you're with someone and you can have a conversation about why would someone make that? Right. What is. So I think it's all good. Anything that piques your curiosity, right? I think that's the key thing. Don't even if you're just shutting curious, down. Right. Just if you're curious, then that is a wholesome engagement as far as I'm concerned, and should be encouraged. As for the first question, I think in the examples that I gave you, there was a need that was perceived, right? And
it might be part of a process.
Well, it's just like Ernie Lindner starting the Saskatoon Art Center because they needed a place for art to be exhibited. Mm-hmm. So in that case, the niche is the artists, right? And so women are finding a hard time getting exhibition opportunities because of stereotypes, implicit bias etc., misogyny. Well, why shouldn't they create a venue where they can support each other and show their work? Same with Indigenous artists or other artists of color. If you can't get in, you can make your own space, right? And even with photography wasn't considered an art
Exactly.
at that time. It
kind of
was
like the Olympics. You have to earn your spot there as a sport, right?
So they really looked at the medium of photography, supporting artists with darkroom and different opportunities. So they're also looking at the medium that they're working in. So finding a space, but also nurturing and being with like-minded people, right? Creating community. So sometimes, it's gender-based or ethnically based. Sometimes it's medium-based. But why not?
Yeah.
If you create the space, more space is good.
And then I do have to ask about technology, because it's different for me, and maybe in my own tiny way I'm being a snob about this, but somebody who actually picks up a brush and dips it in paint and puts it on a canvas is different to me than someone using a very elaborate Etch-a-Sketch and creating art. Like, should there be a difference or not?
No. I mean, and
you're very open-minded.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are things I definitely do not like.
Okay, give me for example.
I'm not going to do that. I don't usually talk about that part. And certainly some things are more exciting to me than other things. But sometimes it is about technical skill. Sometimes it's about the conceptual ideas. There's so many different ways and means to approach the creative process, right? And some is socially engaged art, where there's no object at the end of it. The art is the engagement. So I think it's all, interesting and valuable. But for sure, there's certain things that we are more comfortable with because we're more familiar, because painting's been around for a long time.
Forever and ever. Exactly.
And drawing. And certainly some things are more accessible. Like anybody can draw, right? Like anybody can play
I can't
street
color
hockey.
in the lines. I can't color.
Right? You don't need a lot of fancy equipment to do it.
No, that's true. Yeah.
Right? So that's something that people obviously do easily. And now more and more people have phones. So there's a lot more ability to do digital things. And that will really shape, the next generation of artists. The proliferation and the access
to the technology.
To
absolutely.
the technology from a very young age. So that will be interesting. And some things, they're hot for a moment because it seems novel. That's something I don't like. I don't like things just because they're new.
Right.
And I didn't throw my beta tapes away as soon as VHS came out.
I bought beta too. Just there'd be a whole generation that has no idea what we're talking about.
But I'm not interested in throwing things out or dismissing them because it's last year's color or last year.
Right.
I am a bit slower, and so I'm more circumspect about new things. And some of those new things that make a big splash, a couple years later, no one remembers. Right. And that's something to keep in mind too.
I feel better. I think that's what I was trying to get at, that there's something that's more permanent that's there, that hangs on the wall. And
but even there's amazing conceptual work that was made in the 60s and it still holds up. Right. They nailed it. But there's other conceptual work that's completely forgettable. Just like there's lots of paintings that are
Exactly.
forgettable.
Yes, that's exactly true. That is exactly true. Thank you for this little walk through this bit of history. It just, when I heard it, it so intrigued me because it's not something you associate. You know, we think of our part of the world here as farmers and fields and, you know, trees and lakes, all of that, but not this gathering of artistic minds and then all of that it produced. So thank you. And for those who are not in Saskatchewan or outside of Saskatoon, the Remai is an amazing place. It truly, I don't think I'm just saying that because it's here and I'm a little biased about it. I think it really is quite extraordinary. And so I would encourage you all, if you're ever in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to find that. Sandra Fraser, who is the curator at the Remai, thank you. Thanks for being here.
It was really great to talk to you. Thanks.